All right. Welcome to another edition of the Forecast Contest weekly discussion. Michael Garoon's going to be our weekly lead. Michael, turn it over to you here.
Okay. So start off as we do now with the looking back at the most recent verification. So this was, I believe, the roughest forecast I think we've ever had. I don't believe I've ever seen poor Jason Lin with a minus 900 CRPS score. That's a bit on the rough side. I wasn't much better at minus 628. Um, Ironically, the past, I believe, 3 weeks before this, we had a situation where no human forecast and no model forecast either was warm enough. And this week, the only forecast that was cold enough was the CFS. So, does anybody have anything they want to say about this one?
I guess there's a lot that could be said. Not sure it's appropriate though for this public forum. No, I don't know. Maybe Zach, anything jump out on your end?
I just think we've been kind of waiting for the transition period for the last 3 or 4 weeks now, and compared to that one we had at the July and August, I think this time just one more week, and then that July 9th forecast plus the CFS was the only one who was cool enough. So I guess we could have expected this, but it's hard to plan for this kind of stuff.
Exactly. You know it's coming in a like a high level way. You're just trying to pinpoint
which week
the exact week.
Yeah,
it's hard. Yeah, I guess a couple comments on my end, and I was talking very briefly with Zach and Luke about this offline. A couple of the factors that I think maybe helped culminate into this, these bad scores. One, as Zach already mentioned, pattern change, right? So we finally got the pattern change, but not only did we get the pattern change, but that was after 4 straight weeks of CDDs coming in above expectations. And when I say above expectations, like above all of our forecasts, all of the forecasts that were submitted through the forecast, human and non-human. So we saw that for week after week after week after week. And I think there's a bias that develops there. It's hard to remove, especially for the human forecasters, where you're kind of like, well, maybe I should bump it up a little bit. So then we had that factor, right? Then it just coincidentally, the forecast verified very, very close to the 30-year normal, right? So the 30-year normal nailed it. And then the final, I think, icing on the cake was that, and some of this, obviously I didn't realize until looking after the fact, but the spread or the sigma, especially for the 30-year, is relatively small. And that's because, this was our last the CDD forecast. And so CDDs at this time of the year, there's not as much of a range as, say, maybe in mid-July. And so the 30-year spread was like 3? Yeah, like 3.2. And so, some of these forecasts were multiple sigma away from from what verified, like 2 and 3 sigma away. And so you're going to be heavily penalized if you're 3 sigma away from the verification. That all being said, I think it is worth also another look at the CRPS. Really is harsh in these kind of situations, and I do wonder, as we continue to evolve the forecast contest, if there's other benchmarks that could be a little bit more fair. But that being said, one of the better ways to look at this, or another way to look at it, I should say, is also relative consensus. Because at least that gives you a better idea of how you were against everyone else, right? And right now we don't have that for the weekly, but of course when you look at like the cooling season tables and stuff like that, you can see kind of overall how you benchmark to consensus. So that might be an idea. Maybe something like we could add that on a weekly basis too, where you can see how you performed against consensus. I don't know, it's just an idea.
What other kinds of skill metrics are out there?
Well, there's lots of skill metrics. I'm not an expert on all of them, but like, you know, there's the typical ones like bias and mean absolute error, mean root square error, or root mean square error. Some metrics are more deterministic, and so, or can only be used for deterministic forecasts. Like, I think even like mean absolute error, you know, if we were only forecasting a mean, we could use that. CRPS is similar to mean absolute error, but it is geared to like distributions and probabilistic, so it accounts for the spread. But there are other, I think, metrics, you know, similar to CRPS that we could consider, or maybe, again, maybe it's just adding, maybe it's just adding another layer, like, again, having that relative to consensus, which makes it a little bit more fair when everyone does. Like, for example, I think we were talking about before this, that Philip was the best of these forecasts. Now, he was still technically worse than the 30-year normal, or not as good, but I think relative to the consensus, in fact, we could see, because we do have the consensus on here, don't we? Somewhere, where is it there? Thank
Right
you.
here.
So you could see Philip, you know, relative to the consensus, certainly did much better. But maybe we could actually have, because all these numbers on the weekly level are just relative to the 30-year. So maybe we could consider adding another column or something like that where it's relative to the consensus. So I don't know, but outside of the, you know, I guess those are two different topics here. One is just, you know, performance for the week, and then also kind of just looking at our performance metrics. But back to the performance for the week, the only other thing I want to bring up, and I talked about this in sort of my weekly video, Michael, it's up to you how deeply you want to go into this. But I look back in terms of, I looked at the pattern a little bit, and in terms of what was forecast and what verified. And sort of the long story short on my end, I was only, through the Maxar website, I was able to pull up the verification for October 9th through the 13th, both in terms of temperatures and 500 millibar heights. Yeah, if you want to do this, if you go to the Dynacast page. And then they have some cool features too on their model webpage where you can look back at the guidance from like previous forecasts. So I was looking at like the 6 to 10, 11 to 15 day forecast from the EC and GFS that verified for that period. And sort of the long story short was, from a pattern perspective, I didn't think from a jet stream pattern that the forecast was terrible. Like, from a high level view, it looked to me like the pattern was kind of okay. What struck me though is maybe, and this is more of a research question, but the surface temperatures. Like, so Michael just pulled this up here. You can see the surface temperature anomalies in the western 2/3 of the country, really, really cold. And the models, even as they came into 11 to 15, did not resolve well the scope and intensity of the temperatures. And so I guess a hypothesis that I threw out there and throwing out there now is that, you know, maybe there's a bias. And this is something that folks in the forecast contest or otherwise can look at, where when you're initialized, and this is the last point too, I also looked back into late September, and we were already initialized with a pretty darn cold pool up across Western Canada. I mean, it was nasty. And Michael, you don't have to go back there, but if you did go back to like September 27th or something, you would see it. And so the theory is that there could be a bias in the models, that they underestimate, kind of weaken those cold pools too quickly. And in reality, maybe more cold is able to seep south and eastward. Again, because maybe of a model bias or something like that. It's just a hypothesis I'm throwing out there, but it wouldn't be too complex to tackle in terms of, you know, looking at that, and perhaps in hindsight, you know, with that kind of knowledge and information, in the same, if this similar situation occurs again, you know, we would be able to better account for that. So Michael just pulled up, yeah, this was kind of where the stage was set back in late September. There was a tremendous cold pool in Western Canada. So again, that's a hypothesis thrown out there. It's a research question. I don't know the answer to it, but I think it could be a piece to the puzzle.
We go back. You don't have to, Mike, but if we look at what the map looked like previously, maybe it's just because I don't fully understand how the HDDs and the CDDs are calculated and how they factor in what the population looks like. But if you look at that map, like all the cold was in like Montana, Wyoming, and there's just not a lot of people there compared to the East Coast, where the East Coast saw, I think it was above average warmth for the most part, especially in like Atlanta and most of the Northeast, and that's where the population centers are. So why?
Well, it's I'll answer your question. It's mainly because essentially in October, anything north of, I can't really draw on this, but anything north of, just draw a line through the middle of the country, anything north of that is not really a major HDD or CDD producer in October. I think just looking at this map, I'll just toss a couple other points in here that I was thinking. I don't think anyone expected Texas to be cold, and I think that really threw everybody off because I remember the forecast was for some broad warmth, at least in the south, and Texas being 5 below average doesn't really bode well for a warmer forecast in October, at least for CDDs anyway. And I just want to add in that I do think that a lot of the error on this, at least I'll say this from my forecast, was indeed like I was thinking, okay, the EC is at 13.1. It is October, but it's been way too cold the past 4 weeks. So I'm going to go warmer. That was, so that I did have a little bit of a bias in there for wanting to go warmer because of the past 3-4 weeks. And there was something else, but I don't remember it right now, but I'm sure it'll come back to me.
I wanted to just comment on what Zach said. So again, this is sort of just kind of looking at this map a little bit qualitative, but this forecast actually verified pretty much the 30-year normal. And that's despite the fact that 2/3 of the country is cold, right? So, and there were some areas that got into this. I'm kind of pointing at the map right now, but into where there's important CDDs, like Texas, most of Texas below normal. St. Louis, Kansas City, people live there. Chicago was just on the cold side normal, big cities, So, and I granted, the further north you go, the less. But some of these areas here, and I think so. In other words, if you had flipped this spatially, and instead of like the western 2/3 of the country being cold, it was the eastern 2/3, I think the CDDs would have been much below the 30 and 10-year average. So instead of, I think we finished like 10 CDDs and the 30-year was about 10, we may have finished like 5 or 6. So it was just because spatially it was so huge, like 2/3 of the country was colder than normal. But even despite that, the CDD total finished near the 30-year, and that's because of exactly what you said, because so much of that 2/3 was Rockies and places where there's less population. And then I also just want to comment, it's funny too, in terms of attribution. I don't know if funny is the right word, but I remember some of the conversations we were having. We had some industry guests then, and we were talking about one of the major risks for colder was if I'm chuckling to myself, was that if the MJO got into phases 2 and 3, or in particular 3. I remember looking back at this. Well, obviously some of those colder risks were realized, but it wasn't because the MJO got into phase 3. If Michael, again, you don't have to do this, but if you look at the MJO right now, it's still stuck in phase 1-ish. It really hasn't moved much. So all this happened despite the fact that that MJO risk that we were concerned about really never materialized. It was, again, the fact that the cold air came a lot more south and east than we anticipated. So I guess the takeaway, I guess there could be a couple, but one of them is, forecasting is complex. Sometimes there's risks that we don't even realize, right? So again, we weren't even talking about that risk. I don't think. Maybe we were talking about the temperature risk. I don't remember, but I vividly remember talking about the risks associated with the MJO and how, and that because we didn't think it would be in phases 2 and 3, we felt more comfortable going with the warm signal. And of course, that didn't come to fruition. Michael, I was just thinking, and since maybe we have a little bit more time today, because I think this could be a really helpful tool for everyone. Maybe if you can open another tab with the Maxar, I will quickly show you what I was referring to. Yeah, don't close that because I want you to be able to toggle back and forth. And then when you get there, go to the overview page, please. Yep, I think this is it. Click on any of those images, like that first, any of those images. Is that it? No, okay, close that one, please. It's not that one. Maybe it's composites. Go to composites, please. Top leftish. Yeah, this is it. So in the top left, it says current and archive. So we're going to do archive. All right, so this is, again, really cool. And I kind of looked through this earlier, so I can tell you, I think, where to go. So you're going to go model initialization, perfect. So we're looking at when the model was initialized. Go to about September 29th, I think it is. I think this is going to correspond with the 11 to 15 that verified for our period of interest. Now, go to the top. Let's start with this is pattern. Just go to northern hemispheric so that we're looking at northern hemispheric. And then go all the way down. Oh yeah, perfect. You're at the 11:15. Good. Let's just stick with the EC ensemble just for. Oh, I'm sorry. Is this 850 temps or is this 500?
Yeah, it's 850.
Do 500, and then we'll come back to, do the 500, and then click on the EC, please. So when you look at this pattern, actually you can go back to Dynacast, and if you want, you can pull up the 500 millibar pattern. So where it says, go to the top there. Yeah, go to where it says regions North America, please, and then go, Northern Hemispheric North America, and then now you can do it. Yep, 500, and then maybe build map. Yeah. So now you got it. So now you're looking at 913, 500 millibar height. And again, I'm kind of biasing your view probably because I've already kind of said this. But when I look at that map, and then I switch over to your map, the EC, I say, that's not terrible. I see the ridging in the North Pacific in both. I see this sort of bridge right across the North Atlantic. Obviously the trough in the West is not as well defined, but it's not terrible. It's not like a 180. It's like, oh my God, it didn't see the pattern. But here's where I think it gets more interesting. Now, if you could switch it to surface temperatures for the EC ensemble. Yeah, so switch that please to, I think there's 2 meter temperature. Yep. And then go to United States just so we can zoom in a little bit, please, in terms of region. Yeah, and now pull up the EC ensemble. Now on your other page, now go back if you can to United States or North America, it doesn't matter. Yeah, and then average temperature departure, perfect, and then build a map. So, you can see the difference here, right? Explosive cold, or that one. Michael, you brought up a great point about Texas, right? Now go back to the other map. Yeah, or I'm sorry, that's the Canadian ensemble. If you can, click the EC ensemble. There we go. So the EC ensemble is interesting that the Canadian had it, but let's just focus EC for now because the Canadian typically is not as good and we haven't been using it. When you look at the data we were using, right, the EC ensemble, cold limited to the Northwest, much smaller spatially, much smaller intensity. This goes back to sort of that hypothesis I mentioned about the fact that the models, certainly in the 16 to 20, and this is now in the 11 to 15, it's coming forward, the forecast is coming forward. It's not seeing it, right? It's not seeing it. Now, if you evolve this over to the 6 to 10, that's where the transition becomes more apparent. If you want to do this, you can. So if to do this, you would have to shift the initialization, 5 days forward. So what's that? 30, 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it October 4th?
Yeah, it's close enough.
October 3rd, something like that, yeah. Now this time click the 6 to 10 because we're looking at the 6 to 10. EC ensemble, just stay consistent. And now look at that, right? But that's the 6, that's obviously 6 to 10, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's when it's 6 to 10 days out. But again, this goes back to maybe there's something there where the models at those longer leads don't resolve the temperature pattern as well.
I think, and don't quote me on this, but I remember reading from somebody that the Euro sometimes has trouble with cold air in the Rockies, where it just kind of loses it in the Rockies and wants it to stay there and just kind of washes it away in the longer term, I think. Don't quote me on that, but that might be what, I mean, it makes sense with what happened here, that the cold got to the Rockies and then just kind of died in the model, whereas in reality, obviously it made it a little bit further. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to add, I finally remembered, was CRPS. Like with my bias research, I use MAPE instead of CRPS, and let me just say that the scores were not any more forgiving because it was MAPE. Because I was seeing, I had most of my biases were around 13 MAPE, and they're now all around 16 or 17. So it was not a forgiving week for any type of error method.
This, like, just because my synoptic weather class, I do the weather discussions every week. And I just remember last week in those couple days, it seemed that the jet shifted a lot farther south than normal, and you can almost kind of see it in the departures. I remember it was pretty close to almost hitting Texas. Was there any sort of like teleconnection that could have caused something like that? Like what was the PNA doing at the time, or what was the NAO?
I do have one thought on that, actually. I think it's related to your question. Michael, can you go back to the other model archive you were just looking at?
This one?
Yeah, and you're in the 6 to 10 now, right?
Yeah.
Can you click to the 11? I'm sorry, 6 to 10 is fine. Can you click to 500 millibar height anomalies and then go to hemispheric again, and then click the EC ensemble? I thought this was so when you this is it would be easier to flip back and forth, but in the 11 to 15 or in the 6 to 10, you see this little appendage that of yellow heights that came into Western North America. What is that? British Columbia and Yukon. It's subtle. I think that's pretty important. This is, again, I'm speaking more experientially. I haven't run any analytics on this, but that was not there in the 11 to 15, and presumably it wasn't there in the 16 to 20, even further out. And the difference there, I think, can be pretty dramatic, because what happens is, I suspect, again, all this is my theory, but that there could be dramatic HDD and CDD errors with just subtle changes in that area, because that area is really set, to your point, that is a really sensitive zone for like those classic EP, PNA type teleconnections. In other words, when that ridge is really just centered more toward the North Pacific or further west, you tend to get more troughs in the west, and it tends to be warmer in the east. When the ridges are in Western North America, you tend to get the troughs in the east, and so on. And so the fact that this kind of pulled a little bit there suggests, A, higher pressure at the surface, right? And what is higher pressure at the surface usually associated with? Colder, stronger air masses. And what did we see when we looked at the surface temperatures from the 11 to 15, 6 to 10? All of a sudden, the scope and intensity of that air mass was a lot stronger. Once the model resolved and picked up the fact that the upper heights were going to be a lot stronger, or significantly stronger, and there wasn't going to be a trough, but there was going to be a ridge, it probably supported significantly higher pressure at the surface. The surface pressure probably supported much greater cold, which then leaked into some of the important demand areas. So I think this is another, to bring that to conclusions in terms of a research question. I know we talked about how it could be, I think there could be some value add in terms of looking at potential systematic errors with cold pools in Western Canada in what happens 11 to 15 or 16, 20 days later. I also think this pattern kind of set up in the North Pacific in looking at how well the models resolve those relative to, like, let's say climatology, relative to normal performance. How when your pattern when you're forecasting, when the models are forecasting a pattern like this in 11 to 15 or 16 to 20, how well do they actually resolve it? My hypothesis being that maybe because just if just a subtle change in that pattern can create a significant change in HDDs and CDDs, what we might see in that study is either a systematic bias in a certain direction, like that it tends to be colder, like what happened in this situation, or at least at minimum that there does the overall errors, the mean absolute error just tends to be greater in that situation, because even just a subtle change in how the models forecast that and it verifies can lead to big errors in the eastern 2/3 of the country.
Yeah, and just to kind of add in, if I'm not, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like if the ridging is pushing further onshore, that helps to get that cold air to drain just from a 500 millibar pattern idea. You have let's say you have the jet. If the 11 to 15 originally for the same time period had the jet out here with the ridge, but now the ridge is more over here, well, then that changes the whole pattern downstream. And you could have, instead of the cold being essentially the Pac Northwest, maybe down into California now, you've got, the entire central part of the country is now in a colder pool.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. And just since we're here, let's go back to that 11 to 50. If you want, you could do it on a new tab.
Yeah, should.
Since we're talking so much about this, I guess it's worth taking another second to just look at that. So composites.
Yeah. Composites. Then archive.
Yep.
Then I'm as
so for this one,
was September 29th.
Yep.
Hemisphere.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's compare that area in Western Canada. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, there's the little yellow.
I can make this a little bit.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea. Subtle, right? It's subtle. But
yeah, I think this ridge being just a tad further to the east, like you see this moves east to here, and then that pushes this to the east. So instead of a big ridge over areas like Texas and most of the South, now your ridge, it's really only over just the southeast Florida, which is what we ended up seeing with this. Well, to zoom in, but.
And remember what we started with, right? We already had a tremendous cold air supply underneath that ridge in Southwest Canada going into this thing, right? So then all of a sudden that appendage comes up over the top. Like you said, it just shoved everything south and east.
Yeah, something else I've noticed on maybe this is just my own personal bias. Just maybe I've noticed that a lot of the models, or at least the EC, seems to lose a lot of the blue as you get deeper and deeper into the forecast, because in the 11 to 15, like it's real hard to see where the troughs are. I mean, you can kind of imagine there should be a trough here just from the response from the two ridges, and maybe another trough here, and it kind of shows that. But out here, I don't see anything. Like, there's no blue anywhere, but here there's plenty of blue, and I think that kind of I kind of think that's a little bit significant, just from a bias standpoint, because if the model is having trouble and is washing out troughs in the longer range, or at least from the departures, then I think that's I don't know how it would be significant. Maybe that's a research question that I think I really should be looking into since this is the Euro. Um, but it's got to have something to do with something, I think, because I mean, having all these oranges and reds is like, okay, has no problem seeing the ridges because I mean the ridge is there, and I mean it wound up being a little stronger, and there is a ridge there. It just wound up being a little stronger and a little further east. But where are the troughs? Like I don't. This trough isn't here. This trough, I mean, it's kind of there, but it's significantly weaker and not nearly as dug in. This trough just flat out isn't there. This trough, I mean, that's a little bit. I mean, it's kind of there, but it's a little bit more of a. I'll let that one slide since it's not that big. But this trough isn't here either, and that's kind of significant that this was missed. At least I think it is.
Yeah,
That's,
I agree. I think it absolutely. I think there is a bias in the upper levels, to higher height versus lower heights, and I think that fits pretty well with some of the ideas that we've thrown out today in terms of maybe underestimating, some of the cold pools at the surface too. Yeah, I think that's right. What you're saying, or I think it's certainly something worth further investigation.
yeah. All right. I think we should move along here unless someone has something else they want to add here.
Sounds good.
I'll leave these in case we want to come back to it. All right, so we'll just go into this week. I'll get us started. So, did as I usually do. No changes to my methodology yet. Took a look at the NAO. Looks to be heading negative. I also am adding in a new, step to my forecast, and it's not anything really that new, but I do look now at the verifications just to see how it's been doing. And, it's actually been doing fairly well in terms of accuracy. It's verified a little on the lower side through the past month or so. So, I'm kind of taking not necessarily that it's going to be 2 sigma below the 0 point, but that it'll be on the negative side. So I'm banking on a negative NAO. AO also showing negative, but this is something I know that GFS really struggles with this. Uh, Showing like negative like 1,000 sigma, and then it's like, well, not really, and then it winds up being like positive 2 sigma. But that seems to be the case relatively on the positive side of the verification. So that's where I'm leaning towards a neutral to slightly negative NAO since this is I mean AO since this is fairly on the negative side. So I'm thinking it'll probably be between -1 and 0, and then the PNA slightly on the negative side, but generally fairly accurate. Especially this quick drop that was. I think that's significant that actually was able to forecast such a sharp drop, at least in the 14-day. So a neutral to slightly negative PNA. So that combined with the CPC pattern with warm in the west, cold in the east, I could see this panning out a little bit colder in the northeast. I think is definitely a possibility. But that again depends on that needs the negative NAO and AO, since I think we're finally on the time of year where that does mean colder in the east. So that where here it is. So that wound up with my final number of 70.3. I'm thinking it's going to be fairly cold, a little bit colder than the 30-year, I believe. Um, Average confidence, and that's my 2 cents. Anybody have any questions about anything I said? Okay.
Okay, right now.
Which one of you wants to go?
I'll go next.
All right.
So again, still trying to kind of adapt my. We haven't had a verification for the HDD season yet, so just experimenting with some things. But this week I kind of kept my benchmark at the 30-year as my starting point, just because I know it was the top, or it was the premier forecast metric for last heating season. So that's what I started with. And the first thing I looked at was the CPC, similar to what Mike showed. A lot of warmth in the west, cool in the east, and especially in the northeast. But I think it shows like an equal chance. But still, there's potential that it could be cooler than normal. And then I also looked at Maxar's EC ensemble. I think it's the mic right there. And then if you go to the temperature departures, the 2-meter temperature departures, and then if you go down to the 16 to 20 day, kind of shows a similar pattern, above average, above normal warmth in the west and below normal warmth in the east. So with pretty reasonable agreement between those two, and the fact that there's more population in the east, I went a little bit cooler than normal based on that below normal temperatures we see in the east. So I got a value of 71.
71. Okay, that's not quite the coldest. I guess industry is the coldest or highest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And maybe I'll do mine real quick, and then maybe we can, after that, Michael, you can pull up the industry page and we can talk about Maxar here for a second. But in terms of my forecast, where am I?
Oops, sorry.
Input 1 there. Yeah, so my formula, as I've kind of mentioned the last few weeks, continues to evolve more to my heating season formula, I guess you could say, where I put significantly more weight on like the 30-year averages as opposed to the 10-year average. I think that's sort of the main takeaway. I'm just continuing to tweak it. And presumably as we get to December, I'll completely kind of have it transition over, notwithstanding any other things that, maybe I add in to try to adapt or make it better. Let's see, in terms of any other highlights, the only other thing that I'll mention is the MJO, just because that's a hot topic, comes up every week, tropical forcing. The long story short there was I didn't know what to do with it in terms of skewing the forecast any differently than what I had in the formula, so I didn't change it. I do think it's interesting, right? The map that Michael has up on his screen right now. I think this is interesting though, because I remember talking about this, I don't know, it was last week or the week before. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not, but we are in phase 1. We've talked about this right now, and I think the MJO, this composite here looks pretty good, subjectively speaking or visually speaking anyway, in terms of. Actually, this is well. Actually, go to if you could. This is early January, but go to like I think this is going to be the same in October. If you can, go to like we scroll over to like 241 or 281. Yeah. Where are we? Yeah, a little bit further. Let's get into maybe one more. 291. Boom. So it just coincidentally, right? That pattern is not too far from kind of what verified, right? And I guess I bring this up too because this could be a good lead-in as we talk now about Maxar, and if Michael, if you want to pull up their 16 to 20 page, when I read through some of the notes there, and obviously they're not here, and it's sort of not fair for them, or for because to defend themselves. But they mentioned here in the first couple sentences about this is a pattern regime. They kind of show this ridge trough type pattern, right? Ridge west, trough kind of east, and then it says this is a pattern regime gaining support from an eastward mode in the tropics. And I again, maybe this is just because they're not there to talk about it. I just struggled a little bit with that because, some of the data we're seeing, I think, still suggests more of a trough ridge. in terms of some of those MJO analytics. And so that makes me wonder, do they have, there's different MJO analytics out there. So maybe some of the stuff they're looking at is more of a ridge trough. Maybe I'm not interpreting what they're saying right, whatever the case. But I thought there was some confusion from that. And ultimately, for me anyway, I didn't want to skew my forecast based on the MJO because I didn't see a clear signal.
Yeah, one thing I'll add into that, if I just go back to just find yeah, with I believe, I don't know if this is significant, but right here is still the RMM index is still stuck in phase 1 as the positive Indian Ocean dipole event projects onto the index, creating a stationary signal. I don't, and I'm not, like, my understanding of this stuff is admittedly limited, but if I'm reading this correctly, I think there's 2 conflicting signals. I think there's, and correct me if I'm wrong here. I think this might be slightly different than say the normal MJO, whatever drives it, which I believe is this here, the Kelvin and equatorial Rossby waves. So if these are weak and it's being overridden by this, then this is, I could be completely wrong here, but I think what might be happening is there is an MJO signal and it is progressing, but it's currently being overridden by the Indian Ocean dipole. And that's why we're still in phase 1, but we might not actually be in phase 1, if that makes sense. Because I don't remember who said it or when they said it, but I think this is like a couple months back. Maybe it was Mike Ventris. Is he the one at IBM?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it might have been him when he was showing all those fancy MJO diagrams. I forget what they were called. It was phase space. I think he was saying that there was an MJO. There was no MJO signal at that particular time, but that there was a sneaky MJO signal buried beneath something else in the tropics at that time, and it was hiding the signal, and that's why there was an MJO forecast available. Whereas you would think where there's no signal that there would be the MJO wouldn't really impact the forecast. And I don't know. I could be completely wrong about all that, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a couple thoughts on that. So one, I think generally, if I understand what you're saying, I think that makes sense. I think that's right. I mean, there are these other low pass type signals, right? Paul Roundy also talks about stuff a lot that influence RMM projections. So some people might call it contaminate, whatever. But I think there are these signals that, ENSO, right? El Nino. If you have a strong El Nino, it's going to influence the RMM and the MJO. The RMM being the index that's proxies the MJO, and the MJO being the actual MJO. The one other thing, though, is, maybe it's a little bit semantics, but it gets tricky when we say what's normal and what's not, right? Because there's always stuff going on. And when we look at these composites that groups put together, just like the one you had up earlier, remember that they account for everything, right? So, and unless we dig into those, let's say we dig into that MJO phase 8 and the 256 dates that went into that. Unless we do that, I think you have to assume, right, that there's a whole mixed bag. So if there's a signal that comes out of that phase 8 in October or phase 5 in October or whatever, it's going to have some of these, quote, quote, traditional MJOs. It's going to have some of these non-traditional MJOs where there's a strong El Nino. It's going to have some where the NAO is super negative. And you don't know if there is a distinct difference in how those individual regimes would influence it. And so I think, it's important to talk about, but it's also important not to, and not saying that you're doing this, but to make assumptions that it's not going to behave like a phase A composite because we're in El Nino, or it's not going to behave like a phase A composite because we have an Indian Ocean dipole, right? All those things went into that phase A composite, right? And so the only way really to know if they're going to behave differently in those subsets, in those conditions, is to evaluate those conditions, right? And then of course you get into more issues in terms, including sample size issues and things like that. So it's a tricky, I think, issue and problem to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying at all that, you shouldn't, if the MJO says phase one composite, and, I'm sure they did, what you said, and they calculated all that into their formula. I'm not saying to, just ignore it. I'm just saying that, the MJO might be a bit of a trickier signal for this time period, because, I mean, they mention expected to be a broad feature from the Indian Ocean towards the Western Pacific, and they say that works out for them in their forecasts, and they have their data on that, I'm sure. I'm just tossing out there that the MJO is a bit more this particular week anyway, and I happen to notice it reading this, that the MJO is a bit more tricky this week than it has been in the past, or at least this particular week. I noticed that it was tricky.
And I would argue it's been tricky for a while, right? Because we haven't.
Yeah, going back to last year. Yeah,
I remember when Jason Lynn was here. What was that? Like 3 weeks ago now, or whatever, and us talking about the MGO progressing from phase one possibly to phase three. And I mean that was multiple weeks ago, and it's still. So it's just predicting. First you have to try to predict where it's going to be, and then hopefully understand the relationship of where it's going to be to, to temperatures or to the pattern. And right now it's tricky, right? Just to predict, hey, is it still going to be stuck in phase one? Is it going to move? If it is stuck in phase one, to your point, is it going to behave like a canonical MGO, i.e., something similar to the phase composites, or not? Because, well, this is kind of MGO, but pseudo low pass Indian Ocean signal. Yeah, which is consistent with what you're saying, basically. And it ultimately gets me back to saying I'm not certain how I would hedge like the model guidance, or if you generally said I'm going to forecast normals in the 60s. I'm not sure how you would take that information and hedge your forecast colder or warmer. So it's just a little bit unclear to me. Does anyone, because I want to try to be fair to our guest who's not here, Maxar, does anyone see how what they say in terms of how the MGO supports the cold in the east, or does anyone?
I mean, yeah. So they have the data. I can't see what they saw because they say have historically led to a pattern similar to the forecast. So they clearly looked at this pattern with or whatever the MJO is and whatever the phase state is, and took all that stuff into account with the Indian Ocean and whatnot. They clearly took all that into account, looked at it from a historical standpoint, and this is what they came up with based on what history says. So to me, that makes sense. You have with the MJO, you have to look at the history of where it's at to see, or where it's been to see where it, based on where it's at to you know what I'm saying. I'm kind of fumbling with the words there, but
right.
So this makes sense that they're using the MJO in this way, since that's what the data says. Now I don't have the data, so maybe they're only looking at 2 out of 10 forecasts, and those 2 forecasts happen to work with what they were already thinking. I don't think they did that, but but like I said, I can't see the data. But if I could, I would imagine that most of it shows something like this. Although I assume that there's a possibility that it doesn't. I think adding in even more, and this is the last part I want to add in before potentially moving on, is the EC also seems to show something similar. And while it's mostly washed away, I think the CFS probably shows something similar to that as well, just based off of its CDD forecast. And they'll seem to be, if I I understand this correctly, they all seem to have, most of them seem to be in agreement with some rather, I believe, some rather large extremes. But I kind of think that this, in terms of just the MJO, I think this makes sense.
Well, but so I agree with everything you said about the ECCFS, and there's certainly consistency there. But really, what I was asking, in your own analysis, and this goes for Zach too, in your own analysis of the MJO and your independent analysis, did you guys come to a clear conclusion as to whether the MJO that you would use the MJO to hedge the forecast colder, warmer, or no clear signal?
So, um, what I usually, let me just, I'll just pull up the MJO because I haven't really looked at the MJO in a while. I mean, I look at it, but I don't really like.
Yeah, and if you haven't looked at it, that's a fine answer too. I mean, you just
Yeah, I mean, it's still in phase one. I mean, I actually use, I actually use this page. If I don't know if anybody knows about this, but you get a lot more forecasts, the Euro forecast in here, the Canadian, Japanese. Doesn't give you the UK map, but see Canadian. Some extra stuff to look at, and if you want to go really crazy, you can look at some of these other ones. But um, so I mean, I don't really. Oh, this is really old. My mistake. So like just looking at Emon, which does show a progression, but then it shows it into getting into the null phase, and then you've got the EC null phase. So I mean, to me, as a predictor, unless you have a clear, strong signal, like I'll just use, no, I can't really use this. So like if you had something like we had last year where it was showing a really strong phase 8, phase 1 MJO towards, I think, the middle part of winter. I don't really want to use the MJO unless there's that kind of a strong signal, because there's just a bit, or at least a consistent signal, I should say. Because this right here, I don't. What am I supposed to do with this? Is it phase 2? Is it phase 1? Where is it going? It goes. It starts to go and then it comes back. Like what's happening? I don't like. I don't think it knows what it's doing, and I don't. Or I could be wrong about that, but it looks rather confused, and the signal just looks like it's all over the place the past month or so. This just screams to me as an added confusion to an already confusing thing to do, which is to attempt the 16 to 20-day forecast. Maybe confusing is not the right word, but this just adds in an extra headache, I guess. That unless there's a clear cut signal, I don't think this really adds a great deal. Or again, unless you're industry and you have all the data that you can just put in this forecast or whatever they do and come up with a pattern recognition based on whatever algorithms you've got in your program. In that instance, I would say, yeah, okay, go ahead and use the MJO. That works fine. That's great. But I don't have access to that. If you're the average Joe, or maybe you're only doing this in college or whatever, you don't have access to those kinds of archives and those kinds of programs. Or I mean, you could build them, but um, they already have it. They just put in the number or the map or whatever, and they come up with the forecast like they have here, and they say right here they got it. They put it in, and this is essentially what it looks like, is what I'm gathering. I don't have that. I look at this and I'm like, okay, phase 1 looks like, and then I'd have to go to where, I don't know where it is here. U.S. temperature. I could even do lag temperature if I wanted to. But look at this. Phase 1 shows warmth east, cold west. So I'm come up with the opposite of what they have come up with based on that, and that's why I'm not keen on using that, at least not without that kind of data, because even looking phase 1 to phase 2, like there's a pattern flip here. Cold west, warm east, warm central, with cold northwest and cold mostly east, although centered mainly in the south. So I mean, if I get caught in the pattern flip here, that's another problem that I'd have to worry about. Or even since it shows going from phase 1 to phase 2, then back to phase 1, then now I've got an even bigger problem. And it's just, to me, it's too much of a headache to try to figure out, not every day or not every forecast, because obviously there are times where the MJO isn't going to be wacky like this. But to me, and then I have to also worry about the null phase, because there's a non-zero number of them that are in the null phase, and that's not an impossibility. So now, I've got all those things to worry about, and to me, that's just, I'm going to spend so much time trying to figure this out that I'm probably going to end up making a mistake on some of the more simpler stuff, like the NAO or the AO or something like that. And it's just, I don't like to get too complicated, and I'm just going to have this be the last thing because we're a little bit over time. I don't want to be too complicated with my 16 to 20 days forecast, because I don't really see it being more complicated is a good thing.
Okay.
And I see we're a bit over the time limit, so does anybody have anything else they want to add?
No, I don't. Not on my end. In terms of the research that you've been working on, maybe we can talk about that offline.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then just I think there were some. I think we had a particular or a couple of different action items. Whenever you want to discuss, just let me know, and we can find some time to kind of go over that, or we could save it for another week, or both.
Yeah, I think I'll shoot you an email sometime in the next couple of days, or I could do it now. Maybe I don't know. I'd have to think about it. Because I wanted to add it, like give you some suggestions, maybe, or maybe adding in new metrics, like in the forecast page, like maybe having this be required. And I know nobody's an artist, but maybe instead of having it be a write-up, you could just go into MS Paint and just kind of like draw a basic jet configuration on a US map or something. It's nothing particularly complex or difficult, just kind of to show. I think it would be helpful to kind of just show that and have the people can use that to explain their forecast a little better.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. So let's make sure maybe next week we can. Well, either we'll talk about it offline or what have you, but we can also discuss some ideas there in terms of getting more pattern. Being able to express your views on pattern configuration, because we know that's important in the industry. I've heard Bob Haas has mentioned talked about that too. So that's a great point.
Yeah. All right. So that seems to be it. So we'll stop there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael.
Yep.
We'll,
Thanks.
see you next week.
Yep. See ya. Have a good day.
I guess.